Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this Caabu event to launch a really impressive book by Ian Martin called All Necessary Measures. I'm Nicholas Pelham, The Economist Middle East correspondent, and over the next hour I'm going to be trying to delve into why I think this book is so important, not just for understanding what happened and is happening in Libya today, but why what happened in Libya has posed a major problem for international intervention ever since. Ian was the former UN Special Representative for the UN Secretary General in Libya from 2011 to 2012, those critical years when, at the height of the Arab Spring, Western powers intervened to engineer the fall of Muammar Gaddafi and paved the way for Libya's transition. All Necessary Measures is Ian's account of the international struggle to determine Libya's future, and it's bookended by the UN resolutions which paved the way for intervention in Libya, and ends with the country's first ever free and fair elections a year later. Ian has led UN human rights and peace operations in Rwanda, in East Timor, in Nepal and Libya. He was the Secretary General of the human rights organization Amnesty International, which is an unusual place to come into the upper echelons of international diplomacy. From 2011 to 2012, as I said, he was Ban Ki-moon's head of mission for Libya. He was first the chief post-conflict planning advisor, and then was founder and head of the UN support mission for Libya, UNSMIL. And I think what to me was so striking in the book was that, there are many books that have been written about the ills of foreign occupation. This in many ways is a sort of textbook study of the ills of what happens in its absence. As we'll hear, over 6 months in 2011, Britain and France led NATO in the overthrow of Gaddafi's regime, and then pretty much washed their hands in the aftermath. And so the running theme, I think, throughout the book, and I hope over the next hour, is going to be, should there be more international intervention rather than less? I'm going to, over the next sort of 20 minutes or so, Ian and I will talk about the book, and then we'll open the Zoom session up for questions. So please have them prepared when we come to you in about sort of 20 minutes time. In the first question I sort of wanted to ask was, you're coming to these events sort of pretty much 10 years after they took place, and I kind of wondered why it was that it took you so long to put your account on paper. Was there I get a sense that there was a dilemma that every writer, I think, faces as to whether they are not just spectator, but also player. But in your case, of course, you were instrumental to how events unfolded. And so I wondered, was this a dilemma that you had to wrestle? And how did you end up juggling how far to insert yourself into the narrative?
I've tried to make a practice of writing something reflective about each of the roles I've had in international operations. I think as far as possible, people in significant roles in them should do. And I did, in fact, write something immediately after, or very soon after I left Libya, a contribution to a very good book, also published by Hearst, on the Libyan revolution and its aftermath. And I draw on a lot of the other contributors to that about what happened in 2011. But then, 10 years on, there was a lot more information out there from other people's writings, including memoirs of some of the participants, which I hadn't necessarily had time to read when they first came out. I should be grateful to COVID for giving me the lockdown time that I used to read all that. But it wasn't just that. I also felt increasingly irritated, I must say, by some of the very superficial references to Libya that are now very common in discourse. One frequently sees Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya mentioned as a kind of trio. I read an article on Ukraine the other day that referred to the US-led invasion of Libya, which isn't quite how I remember it. So I felt there was a case for setting out a rather more nuanced view as to what had actually happened. But you're also right that I wanted to reflect on my own role, because whereas I'm reasonably confident that roles that UN operations I was responsible for in East Timor and Nepal were part of a generally positive trajectory in those places, that's certainly not so obvious in the case of Libya, and I wanted to reflect on my own role, on the role the UN played, and what might or might not have been different.
In hindsight, was there more that you felt that could have been done, not just by the UN, but by you? Is there a sense that you kind of feel the burden of history on your shoulders?
No, that's going too far. I don't. In many ways, I think the role that the certainly UNSMIL, the mission that I headed, played in the first year, the year of the first interim government, was a positive one in major aspects of the situation, including helping the Libyans to deliver an election that gave a real possibility of a base for progress. But there are major areas where there was a collective failure by the Libyans, of course, a failure by the external actors involved, particularly in terms of the security sector and the aftermath of the uprising itself. And that has been one of the central issues that Libya has failed to tackle in the 10 years since.
It's an interesting title, All Necessary Measures, with a question mark. I guess for the uninitiated, it's also perhaps cryptic, enigmatic. Could you unpack it? Why did you choose the title, and why add the question mark?
All necessary measures is the term the UN Security Council uses when it authorises the use of force. That's what it means, and it was the key phrase in the resolution that authorised military action in the case of Libya. All necessary measures to protect civilians and civilian populated areas. The question mark, I hope, asks several questions that the book tries to address. Was it really necessary, in the sense that was the case for intervention to prevent a massacre in Benghazi and elsewhere really necessary? Was the manner in which the intervention was then carried out necessary? And was all that was necessary done to help prepare for what came afterwards, the so-called day after? So I like to think that the title alludes to several of the questions that need to be asked.
You're very good at almost sort of with the knack of a journalist at asking the questions, and you sort of weave throughout the narrative as to kind of what the answer could be. You kind of present both sides in a very diplomatic fashion. I mean, where do you stand at the end of the day on the question of the interpretation of the UN resolution by Western powers, particularly by Britain and France? Did they overstep their mark? Were they just there solely to protect populations, or did they have other objectives in mind?
Well, first, I think there was a case for intervention. There are those who maintain that nothing very nasty would have happened in Benghazi, even if there hadn't been intervention. I don't agree with that. I think there was a good deal of exaggeration. The term genocide was thrown around as it is today. But nonetheless, I think there was a case when Gaddafi failed to respond to all kinds of other pressures and sanctions for intervention to prevent what would otherwise have happened in Benghazi and elsewhere. Then the question becomes, was it necessary to drive on with a full-on military operation? And I asked the question as to whether there might not, as the British general in charge of the operation suggested, might not have been a pause after Benghazi had been saved in order to try to produce a managed transition, a mediated outcome. I devote a chapter to whether there ever really was a possibility of the efforts of the United Nations, the African Union, Norway, who played a little discussed mediating role, and others, whether that ever could have produced a managed transition. I certainly do think, I don't myself think that there was an initial intention to overthrow Gaddafi. I think there was more a kind of an assumption after Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak in Egypt had gone so quickly that that was probably what was going to happen as a result of the Arab Spring. But as time went on, the objective of protecting civilians became an objective of regime change, justified in part by the argument that as long as Gaddafi was still in power, civilians were not safe elsewhere, and therefore those involved identified the objectives of protection of civilians and regime change. Now, when it comes to analysing the military operation, and the first question is, did NATO itself exceed its mandate? And I think ultimately it did. I think it went beyond military operations that were justified in terms of protection of civilians and became aerial support to the rebel advance on Tripoli and elsewhere. But one of the things that again, I don't think there's been sufficient attention to is the bilateral operations of France and the UK, and particularly Qatar and the UAE, who put special forces on the ground and played a major role in mentoring, supporting, and arming the forces fighting against Gaddafi. And that I don't think was in any way covered by the United Nations resolution, which required measures that were taken to fulfill the resolution to be formally notified to the Secretary General and by him to the Security Council, and that certainly wasn't done.
By the end, did you feel that they were directly intervening on? I mean, they were intervening on behalf of the rebels. No, it was a UN interpretation of a UN resolution, which led to supporting of one side against the other, and to hell with the arms embargo when it affected the side you wanted to win.
Yeah, no, that's perfectly clear so far as the UK and France are concerned. I mean, I quote David Cameron as saying to friends when Tripoli fell, "I've just won a war," which there was a certain amount of triumphalism on the part of those who had definitely been seeking a rebel victory. So yes, there's no doubt the objective became regime change on the part of those actors. And Cameron refers in his own memoir to a cell in Paris in which France, the UK, Qatar and the UAE coordinated the special forces action that led to the assault in the West that ultimately took Tripoli. Number 10 referred to those four countries as the Four Amigos, which is a little ironic in retrospect when one considers what good amigos some of them are today.
you had spent sort of several months with UN planning for the post-conflict scenario. You then went in fairly quickly to Tripoli after Gaddafi had fled the city. To what extent did you feel that you had the backing of the parties that had been sort of at the forefront of the war? To what extent did you feel that the kind of responsibility to protect Libyans during the military operations continued sort of once that transition had begun?
There was actually a strong consensus in the UN Security Council in support of the post-conflict role of the UN, the role of UNSMIL. I mean, there have been lots of squabbling in the Security Council as Russia, South Africa, and others criticized the carrying out of the military operation, but there was unanimous support for the UN role on the ground. What was never really addressed in the Security Council was really what was going to be done in relation to the defense sector, because we, the United Nations, were asked to play a role in helping develop police in Libya. That was a request the Libyan National Transitional Council made of us, and that's something the UN tries to do, however well or badly. But what the UN doesn't do is develop militaries, and that is normally done by whatever bilateral countries a particular country invites to do that. And I certainly assumed that that was a role that would fall to whichever of the countries the new Libya regarded as its friends, those that had supported it militarily during the uprising. But that didn't happen, and they largely stood back initially from thinking with the new authorities how they were going to tackle the extraordinarily difficult question of building an army where even Gaddafi hadn't had a real state army, or only elements of one, and after a period in which there'd been a proliferation of armed groups who either needed to be integrated into state security forces or disbanded and reintegrated into civilian life. That central question wasn't, I think, sufficiently thought about or addressed by any of the major actors.
In part, I think that's going to answer some of my next question, but maybe not all of it. I mean, you have a fascinating account, which I think even to Libya hands is kind of largely forgotten, of an earlier UN intervention, actually, in kind of standing up the Libyan state in 1949 and sort of really sort of seeing it through to what that to a fragmented state and creating sort of the state of Libya with its kind of three composite parts, and that took place from 1949 to 53 under Adrian Belt. I kind of wonder, what was it the UN got right then, or what was possible then that kind of the UN seems to have failed to do today? And when you look at just how fragmented and chaotic and ungoverned much of Libya is.
I don't think you can really compare the state of Libya at the end of the Second World War and the British and French military administrations and the period at the end of the uprising. Libya in 1949 was an extremely poor country. It certainly didn't have its own armed groups around the place. There were certainly issues that arose then in creating a state in Libya that was still had major echoes in 2012. I mean, the whole question of whether this was to be a federal or a unitary state, the balance of representation between the three historic regions, Cyrenaica, Tripolitania, and Fezzan, the east, west, and south of Libya. So those issues were there, but I don't think one can draw many analogies. But it is an extremely interesting history, and one that is largely forgotten inside the United Nations. Certainly, I remember telling the Secretary General a little about it, although I had only informed myself about it once my attention turned to Libya. But it's well remembered by many Libyans, and it did account, I think, for the fact that in 2011, 2012, Libya was perhaps more open to a UN role than other countries in the region might have been.
Yeah, I mean, it's still, the comparison is kind of really stark when it comes to how the UN has taken responsibility for seeing a country through to through a transition, and the transitions have obviously ended in very different places. And I just wonder, I mean, your great success and perhaps was in helping to see through the first elections, and you're probably very wise, having seen through elections to sort of bow out on the high. In hindsight, I mean, many would argue that those elections were premature. In fact, they would argue that a country which has been through so much sort of bruising of centuries of foreign domination, of dismantlement, really, of standard state structures during the Gaddafi era, and then through through military conflict, that the country was just sort of too disorientated by elections. In fact, many today would argue that what the country really needs, as is a strong man, and that stability through strong rule is more likely than through a democratic process. Do you think, in hindsight, it was precipitous to rush into elections?
No, I don't, and I think the situation of Libya in 2011 was the consequence of having had a strong man for 40 years, and this is maybe what you get afterwards. No, I think there's a whole literature about post-conflict elections, and there is a tendency, and it's quite right in some cases, to say that one shouldn't rush into elections, but you have to look at what acceptance there is of whatever authorities are going to exist in the meantime. And in the case of Libya, the National Transitional Council very clearly felt that it was its job to hold elections and transfer power, that it was not its job to prolong itself, and that had been the subject of a major debate in Benghazi in August 2011 as to how that would be done. The first interim government, in exactly the same way, felt that it only had interim authority to see the country through for a limited period, and it certainly didn't, I think, have the kind of authority that would have been necessary to address the security sector and to get the armed groups that had fought for the revolution to stand down. So I think in the case of Libya, it was necessary to hold elections as a basis for future legitimacy. That was certainly the overwhelming desire of Libyans, and it wasn't that the international community pushed Libyans into elections. Far from it. It was entirely a Libyan demand and decision, and indeed they went ahead with local elections in Misrata and Benghazi without any encouragement or support from the international community. They'd been denied the opportunity to take democratic decisions throughout the whole Gaddafi period. They were determined to have that opportunity. The tragedy is that the General National Congress that was the outcome of those elections didn't in the end provide the strong basis for a new government whose authority was then sufficient to address the problems. But I don't believe that there was a reasonable alternative in 2012 to going with elections, and the what's called the HNEC, the High National Electoral Council Commission, did a remarkable job. I mean, it was there was a smallish international UN and other team assisting them, but it really was a very considerable Libyan achievement with high registration, high turnout, and very considerable elation across the country afterwards.
I'm tempted to ask sort of what significance that all has for the aborted electoral process now in Libya, but perhaps this is the moment to open up to the floor, and I'd very much like to come back to that. And I hope somebody, from who's on the call might want to probe that further. I think there is the possibility for people to ask questions in person, which would be great. It saves listening just to the two of us and to bring others into the conversation. But I think first off, we have a question from Stephen Booth, who asks, given that Libya is made up of 3 very disparate and large territories, is it really viable as a self-governing independent country? Would it just be better if all 3 parts went their own way?
The interesting thing is that view has had very little support in Libya. There was a push from the east in 2011, 2012, but even in the east, former Cyrenaica, that never had overwhelming support. And yes, the 3 regions have somewhat different histories, but there are a large number of Libyans who cross those regions in their relationships, in their lives, and I don't personally see there are Libyans in this audience who could answer the question much better than I could, but I don't see a case for Libya to divide back into the 3 original Ottoman provinces. Of course, the region that Libya, having started out with a federal constitution in 1951, then modified that for a unitary constitution, was in part because there was no other good way of addressing the question as to how the oil wealth of Libya would be distributed, and there would be extraordinary difficulties arising out of separation in terms of the sort of the equitable access to the oil wealth that Libya has gone on sharing remarkably even through the periods of 2 governments in East and West and civil war.
Fascinating. We have a question from Ali Bahajoub. Ali, are you on the Zoom call? Could you ask that in person?
Yes, I can actually. My name is Ali Bahajoub from North South Publications. I was wondering actually about the agreement agreed upon by all the conflicting parties in Skirat near Rabat under the auspices of the United Nations. That seemed to have actually struck a chord with the rest of the population, and yet the implementation of it has obviously come to a standstill. Is that still something that can be salvaged?
Well, I've written strictly about 2011, 2012, partly because I haven't had the degree of involvement, even following it externally, let alone on the ground and engaging with Libyan actors, to regard myself as a judge of the sort of the major issues since then, let alone wanting to second guess my successors as heads of UNSMIL or special advisors who have had the responsibility of trying to steer things since. Obviously you can go back to Srigat, but also there's now the further Libyan political agreement that was the foundation of the unification of the government at the beginning of last year. How far the elements of past agreements are still what will serve Libya well in going forward, and how far elements of those have to be renegotiated. I think for a UN view, you have to ask Stephanie Williams, and for other views, I'm not the right person to answer the question.
Great. We really have, there are a lot of questions. Alex Whiteman, are you there? If not, let me ask Alex's question, which is, how do you address the issue of the interpretation of UN Security Council resolutions? In this case, you seem to point the finger at the way the resolution was interpreted. Was it not also an interpretation of a resolution that the US and its allies used to legitimize their occupation of Iraq? Why are these documents so ambiguous as to present openings for interpretation rather than textual clarity?
Well, that's a very good question. And towards the end of the book, I quote someone who refers to the several instances in which the Western permanent members of the Security Council, having got a resolution that suited them, essentially then forged ahead without any further accountability to the Security Council as to how the resolution was interpreted. And that's, of course, exactly what happened in the case of Libya. The resolution required those acting under the resolution to report to the Secretary General, who would then report to the Security Council. And NATO was at least dutiful in forwarding reports, but they weren't reports that really address the difficult questions as to the objectives of the operation, the manner in which it was being carried out. And the bilateral actors, in most cases, didn't at all notify the Council as to what they were doing. The Council never asked for NATO to come before the Council and actually answer questions or be briefed. So there is an important literature as to how, particularly the relationship between NATO and the UN Security Council might operate if NATO were ever acting under Council authorization, although I don't think that's going to happen again in a hurry. But it applies in other cases too. It's really one of the major issues that I point to, that there was a failure of accountability, both in terms of the formal NATO operations and even more in terms of the secret special forces operations, arms supplies, and so on.
There's an interesting question from Victor Casanova, which relates to this, which is kind of the role of Moscow. In hindsight, it almost looks as if they were absent. Why were they not trying to hold the parties to account? Why did they not decide to go ahead and block the UN Security Council and prevent the intervention in the way that it unfolded?
Well, the Arab Spring occurred during the presidency of Medvedev, when Putin was prime minister, but it was Medvedev as president who had the lead responsibility on foreign policy. He had been fairly open to the atmosphere of the Arab Spring early in 2011 in Davos. He took the decision that Russia would not block the resolution in the Security Council, that it would abstain. That was controversial at the time in Russia. The Russian ambassador to Libya resigned. There's a big question that I cite various people's views, but I'm not sure anyone can answer definitively as to what had or hadn't gone between Medvedev and Putin at that time, because Putin very quickly, once the military action started, called it a medieval crusade, and Medvedev, retorted in public, defending the decision to abstain. And Russia even, or despite its criticism of the NATO operation, did try to play a constructive role in persuading Gaddafi to leave in the course of the summer. So I think the internal Moscow dynamics are a very interesting question, but certainly in retrospect, it's surprising, and we're now seeing in a lot of the writing about Ukraine as to how major a role in the development of Putin's thinking some analysts believe the Libyan intervention played. I mean, obviously it shaped the Russian response when it came to Syria, but more than that.
Chris Doyle has a question related to this and to the role of the African Union. Chris?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was wondering, Ian, if you could comment about the way in which the African Union was treated in all of this. There was obviously a mission to try to get reconciliation between the varying parties. Do you feel that their mission was undermined or supported or backed by leading members of the international community?
Yes, without question. I think the African Union was treated very badly, and again, the wounds of that are still quite apparent today, including in Libya discussions amongst member states, but more widely. You know, there was really a tendency, because of Gaddafi's sort of largesse towards some African countries and some African leaders, there was a tendency in the West, I think, to assume that the African Union wanted to save Gaddafi. I think that's a misrepresentation. The Arab Union faced quite difficult questions in Tunisia and Egypt, as well as in Libya, as to how to reconcile the position it had taken of opposition to unconstitutional changes of government with the fact that these unconstitutional changes of government you know, seem to be in the direction of its other objectives of democratization. So I believe that the African Union effort to play a mediating role was not one designed to save Gaddafi, although they certainly resented people from outside Africa saying an African leader must step down. I think they were looking for a managed transition, and I think the way that they were, I mean, I know how bruised they were by the way they felt treated by Paris and London and others, and I think that was a major mistake, at least if anyone wanted a mediated outcome, because I think the only way there might have been a mediated outcome would have been if those with influence on Gaddafi, which particularly meant the African Union and Zuma, had pushed him towards that. And the countries supporting the NTC, particularly France and the UK, had urged them in that direction rather than encouraging a military outcome. I'm not saying that that would have produced a mediated outcome, because at the end of the day, I think Gaddafi's obduracy was a huge obstacle. And of course, as time went on, I suppose as we're seeing in Ukraine today, bitterness increases as war crimes are committed, and even people who at the beginning of a conflict are perhaps willing to look for a negotiated outcome become less inclined to do so. But yes, I think the African Union role deserves re-examination. I mean, it's had it from people other than me, but I think it's a part of the story that again hasn't been well reflected in Western analysis.
I've got another question. I just wanted to open up, ask participants as well whether they had questions they wanted to ask. If you could please either raise your hand or better put your question in the chat, and then I can come to you. Reading this book, you do have a sense of sort of premonition. You can see, you know, we know where Libya has gone today, and I just wondered how clear it was to you, and at what point you felt that the seeds of kind of impending collapse had been sown. When did you start to have a feeling that this wasn't all going to turn out with a happy ending? And was there a kind of, did you have an epiphany at some point, you know, something could be done, and if action wasn't taken, you know, Libya was going to go pear-shaped?
I was still reasonably optimistic when I left Libya in September 2011. You know, we've already referred to the seeming success of the elections. Of course, the attack on the US compound in Benghazi and the death of US Ambassador Chris Stevens and his colleagues, Salafist attacks on Sufi shrines in Tripoli, other attacks on the international community, growing wave of assassinations of former military officers in Benghazi. I mean, there were very worrying signs. There was also, you know, real revulsion from very many Libyans at the death of the US ambassador. So right up to the time I left, I was still hopeful that the GNC, the General National Congress, and the government that came out of it would be able to take Libya forward. I suppose if any one thing really made me acutely worried for the future, it was the political isolation law that excluded some key Libyan players, the president of the GNC, Dr. Mahmoud Jibril, who had been effectively the greatest winner of the 2012 elections. That seemed to me from afar to be extremely ominous. But I didn't scuttle and run because I saw things going badly. On the contrary, I'd stayed longer than I had ever said I would, because I had never seen myself as a non-Arabic speaking, non-expert in the region. I'd never seen myself as the right person to play a longer term role in relation to Libya. I had agreed to set the mission up and then see it through to the election, and that's what I've done.
We have a question from Peter Millett, who's former British ambassador to Libya.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. And I think I'll allude a little bit to the question you started asking, Nick. And Ian, you talked about the euphoria in Libya around the elections in 2012. And we've heard Stephanie Williams and over the last few months talking very much about the number of Libyans who wanted to vote last year and still want to vote. Are there any lessons that you saw from 2011, the run-up and the aftermath of the elections in 2012, which your successors in UNSMIL should bear in mind for the future?
Well, the first thing is that the framework for the 2012 elections was quite well set. The National Transitional Council had adopted a constitutional declaration, which, while it was a fairly brief document, it set out a roadmap. The NTC and its electoral committee did significant work on the framework for the elections. As last December's elections approached, there was still obviously enormous controversy as to whether a proper framework for the elections really had been agreed, and where its legitimacy came from, and how that was to be implemented. So clearly, one needs that kind of framework. So, I mean, I'm afraid that the story of elections in Libya, you know, is not a happy one, because the 2014 elections, although they produced the House of Representatives, happened with significantly less registration and turnout than the 2012 election had. But I think there's no doubt now that there's no doubt that Libya needs elections. You can't continue to have a situation in which what legitimacy institutions have goes back 7, 8 or more years, and clearly a large number of Libyans who registered for the December elections think that there is a need for the renewal of legitimacy of their leadership. But the framework for that has to be properly set, and you know, it was clear long before one might even say the international meeting in Paris that again said elections must go forward. It was already perfectly clear that they couldn't on a basis that offered any prospect of a government or a president in Libya whose authority would be accepted across the country. And that's where there's another major problem, I think. You know, there was no discussion yet in 2012 about electing a president. That was left open for a future constitution. A decision to have an elected president poses a kind of winner-takes-all scenario, which is extremely difficult to see winning acceptance across all Libya's regions.
So how do you? So Peter, do you want to come back on that, or?
I think it's just it's an interesting point to pick up from Ian's past experience, and I appreciate the frank answer that he's given us.
Thank you. Yeah.
Frank, but not particularly helpful. Yeah.
So if you're dealing with incumbents that don't want to make way for an electoral process and are resisting that, do you need to have a more robust international intervention? I suppose it's a kind of, it is this question that kind of surfaces throughout the book. Should there have been more rather than less international intervention in Libya? Should it have been more robust? And should it be more robust now?
Well, I mean, you know, Libya now, ironically, has found itself with much more international intervention. I mean, not unified international intervention, but is much more the victim of external actors than it ever was in 2011, 2012. And you know, what one needs is a reasonably unified and constructive approach from the international community, but that's not what Libya has been experiencing. Exactly the opposite. Whether now there's more of a prospect of the external actors that have gained in influence supporting a single constructive path forward is the major question, and what has to be worked on. But after being in Libya, I spent 3 years in New York watching the Security Council up close, including in its decision-making on Libya, and this was not a pretty sight.
There's a kind of related question from another British ambassador to former British ambassador to Libya, Richard Northern. Richard, are you there? And can you ask the question?
Yes, thank you, Nicholas. The question is a bit related, and it picks up several references I think you've made, Ian, talking today, to the lack of any swift or serious effort to tackle security sector reform immediately after the conflict in 2011 and 2012. And I strongly agree with that, but I remember at the time that there was not really an effective forum for coordinating efforts. So all the external actors went their own way and had their own objectives. And I wonder if you thought that the UN or somebody else could have provided a forum or might have tried to coordinate efforts more successfully, given that the external actors didn't seem capable of doing it themselves.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, that is what happened. As I said earlier, my kind of assumption was that the Libyans would decide which of the which countries they wanted bilateral support from. Qatar sought early on to play a coordinating role. That wasn't acceptable either to the Libyans or to the other external actors. So various countries made various bilateral approaches, to the point when the first chief of staff of the armed forces, General Mangouche, eventually came to the UN out of frustration with the competition amongst the bilaterals and asked the UN to play a coordinating role. And we did then begin to play a coordinating role and to equip UNSMIL to do more of that by bringing in a senior Australian former general and staffing up a bit for more involvement with the defence sector. But that's not normally a role that the UN plays. Perhaps we should have anticipated that, but it's not a role that we had been asked to play by the Security Council, by the leading bilaterals. On the contrary, the UK at the time, had the view that they didn't want the UN particular. I mean, the UK cooperated in coordination once it happened quite strongly, but it wasn't the starting position that this was a role that the UN should play. Yeah, there's definitely a lesson there. But the point that has to go along with that is that we were not just talking about, conventional security sector work. I don't think there's a precedent really for the kind of challenge that dealing with the proliferation of armed groups that Libya was left with at the end of the revolution, in a country that didn't have anything left of a strong army. I don't think there's a precedent for that. So the Libyan actors, the international actors, were facing an almost unprecedentedly difficult situation.
We've got sort of 6 minutes left and 3 questions that'd be great to get in. The first from Ahmed Jahani. Ahmed, are you there?
Yes, I am there. I will put myself on the video, but I excuse the way I am in a hospital going through a pneumonia, but towards the end of it, I came, as I promised Ian, that I will, participate. I'm sorry I didn't get to read the book, but I really think that of all the people that I have worked with, of course, for those who don't know me, I was the Minister of Stabilization during that period of 2011. It's all volunteer work, by the way. And of all the people that I have worked with, I have really a great appreciation for Ian. And I think his commitment, his understanding of how this is a very thankless task and it may go wrong. Not only because Libyans were also ready for the kind of future after 42 years of the despot, but also because there were all of these cooks, and now we have even more of cooks. Many of them are this and that, and they pretend that they know Libya. So with that, just to make sure that I say those words for history. 50 years ago, almost to this summer, when I arrived at Harvard Law School to study international law, there were 2 authorities in international law, Louis Sowen on the UN Charter and Richard Baxter. They were both my teachers. And intervention meant intervention. It didn't mean all of this sugar coating of protecting. I mean,
we've got
this
like
and
three.
that.
We've got 3 minutes left, and 3 other people wanted to ask questions. So yeah.
So there is really no more questions other than the fact we are harvesting or reaping the bitter, what do you call it, of that obfuscation and confusion. Ian, I'm looking forward to reading your book, and I definitely have had the honor to have worked with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. Can we just maybe take all three questions and then let Ian wrap up? Zahra, followed by Ed, and then Ali. Zahra, you are kind of you're key to what remains of Libya's civil society. It'd be very interesting to hear your question.
Yes, thank you very much. And I've been participating in the UN-led peace processes over the last 8 years. And so my question was to Ian, knowing that he has a reputation of starting up missions and then leaving them after not very long when the hard period comes. So I was wondering if there are any evaluation, assessment, lessons learned. You've been in Timor East. Couldn't there have been lessons learned and applied to Libya? And I gratefully appreciate that you now say that it was more of a regime change rather than implementation, or it was actually a manipulation and misuse of the responsibility to protect, because the so-called protected were never protected, and they were never secure or safe. So my direct question to you now, with this turbulent transition after the UN military intervention in Libya, underpinned by the responsibility to protect, and with all the failure that we see in multilateralism today and the deadlock in the Security Council, especially when it comes to the renewal of the mandate of UNSMIL, isn't it time to have an exit strategy for UNSMIL? Isn't UNSMIL at the moment a burden to the UN? Can we see a better intervention in Libya based on the responsibility to build R2B, what has been destroyed in Libya after this intervention back in 2011? What kind of a multilateral mechanism can play in a world that is in a global disorder at the moment? And I think the first thing, especially after the all failures that UNSMIL during its so-called nation building, state building, the failure, even in the peace process.
Zahra, I'm sorry, we're going to have to, it needs time to respond to that, and we're pretty much out of time.
So something else other than UN mission in Libya?
Yeah, can we let? And apologies to the other two. We're simply out of time. Ian, if it seems a very good question to wrap up on, if you can just sort of try and do that in 60 seconds or so.
Sure. First, let me thank Dr. Jahani and wish him a further speedy recovery, and look forward to having a cup of coffee with him when he's out of hospital. Zahra, that's a huge question. I mean, I'd be delighted to be part of a discussion of it, because after Libya, I was a member of a high-level panel that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed to think about the future of peace operations. Of course, that's still UN peace operations, and you're asking whether things should be taken out of the framework of the UN. But I think that's a very fair question for Libyans to ask themselves as to how they would like to design the most useful form of international support that they could conceive of. And I'd be happy to take part in such a discussion, but there's no simple answer to it, and I can't offer one in 60 seconds.
Thank you, Ian. Apologies to those who still had questions and we didn't have time for, but we are out of time. It really is a very impressive read. If all necessary measures with a question mark, you do get the answer at the end of it. It's very well worth reading, and just to get a sense of you know, why Libya has been so critical to international intervention, not just for Libya, but for the Middle East and far wider. I'm very grateful to all the participants. Thank you to Caabu for laying on the event, and particularly to Ian Martin for launching the book with us today. Thank you all, and hope you can join Caabu again soon.
Thank you.